Forgiveness without accountability isn't healing. It's permission for the harm to continue. You've been taught that forgiveness is noble, that letting go makes you stronger, that the faster you forgive, the more evolved you are. But what if that's not strength? What if it's self-erasure, disguised as virtue? Think about it. How many times have you forgiven someone, not because they changed, but because you were tired of carrying the anger? How many times did "I'm sorry" feel less like accountability and more like a key that unlocked access back into your life? We've romanticized forgiveness so much that we no longer question its timing. We forgive before we process, before we confront, before the other person even understands what they did. And in doing so, we trade justice for comfort. This isn't about becoming bitter. It's about seeing clearly. Because there is a version of mercy that doesn't heal you, it silences you. And the most dangerous part, it feels like growth when it's actually surrender.
You didn't just wake up one day and decide to over-forgive. You were trained. Somewhere along the line, you learned that keeping the peace mattered more than telling the truth, that being liked mattered more than being respected, that conflict meant loss, and forgiveness meant survival. So you adapted. You became the one who understands, the one who excuses, the one who says, "It's okay," even when it isn't. Because deep down, you believe that if you don't forgive quickly, people will leave. And losing them feels worse than losing yourself. But here's the uncomfortable truth. When you forgive too easily, you're not being compassionate. You're negotiating with your own boundaries. You're rewriting reality to make someone else's behavior easier to accept. And over time, this becomes automatic. You don't even notice the moment where your pain gets minimized because you've done it for so long. It feels normal.
Forgiveness, in its purest form, is supposed to come after understanding, after accountability, after truth. But what most people practice isn't forgiveness, it's avoidance. You forgive because sitting with anger is uncomfortable, because resentment feels dangerous, because you've been told that holding on to pain makes you toxic. So you rush to release it, not because it's resolved, but because you can't tolerate the weight of it. This is psychological bypassing. Instead of confronting what happened, you skip ahead to the part where everything is fine. You silence your instincts, you override your boundaries, and you call it healing. But unresolved anger doesn't disappear. It buries itself. It leaks into your relationships. It distorts your sense of self-worth. And eventually, you find yourself in the same cycle. Hurt, forgive, repeat. Wondering why nothing ever really changes.
You've probably been praised for it, for being the bigger person, for not holding grudges, for having a good heart. But what if being the bigger person has just been a socially acceptable way of telling you to tolerate disrespect? Because real strength isn't measured by how much you can endure. It's measured by what you refuse to accept. When you forgive without requiring change, you're not rising above the situation. You're lowering the standard for how you're treated. And people notice, not consciously, maybe, but behavior adapts to what it's allowed to get away with. If there are no consequences, there is no reason to evolve. So your forgiveness becomes a loophole, a reset button, a quiet signal that says, "You can hurt me, and I'll still be here." Every time you excuse behavior that hurts you, something subtle happens. You abandon yourself. You take the blame. You rewrite the narrative. You convince yourself that maybe you were too sensitive, too emotional, too difficult, because it's easier to question yourself than to accept that someone you care about chose to harm you. But this comes at a cost. Your self-respect begins to erode, your boundaries blur, and slowly you start believing that this is what you deserve. This is how people become doormats, not because they're weak, but because they've been conditioned to prioritize connection over dignity. And the tragedy is, the more you forgive without accountability, the more you reinforce the very behavior that hurts you.
This pattern doesn't come from nowhere. It often starts early. When love is inconsistent, when care is mixed with harm, when approval feels conditional, you learn to adapt in order to survive. You learn that love requires tolerance, that pain is part of connection, that if you just adjust yourself enough, people will finally treat you better. So you become hyper-forgiving, not because it's healthy, but because it once protected you. As a child, this made sense. It helped you maintain attachment. It helped you cope with unpredictability. But as an adult, that same pattern becomes a trap. Because now, you're not just surviving, you're repeating. And unless you interrupt it, you'll continue to attract and tolerate the same dynamics over and over again.
You've been taught to fear resentment, to see it as something toxic, something to get rid of as quickly as possible. But what if resentment isn't the enemy? What if it's information? Resentment is your mind's way of saying something isn't right. It's a signal that a boundary has been crossed, that your needs have been ignored, that your value has been compromised. And instead of listening to it, you've been trained to suppress it. But suppressed signals don't disappear, they intensify. So instead of rushing to forgive, what if you paused? What if you allowed yourself to feel the discomfort, not as something to escape, but as something to understand? Because within that discomfort is clarity. And within that clarity is power. Forgiveness isn't the problem. Premature forgiveness is. Real forgiveness requires evidence, not promises, patterns. It requires someone to acknowledge what they did without deflection, to take responsibility without shifting blame, to demonstrate consistently that they understand the impact of their actions. And most importantly, it requires time. Time to rebuild trust, time to observe change, time to decide whether this person deserves continued access to your life. Because forgiveness is not an obligation, it's a response to accountability. And if accountability isn't present, forgiveness becomes self-betrayal.
This is where everything changes. When you stop forgiving automatically, you create space. Space to think, space to feel, space to choose differently. You begin to realize that not everyone deserves immediate access to your softness, that your empathy is valuable, and misusing it comes with consequences. You learn to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it, to hold boundaries even when it risks losing people, to prioritize self-respect over temporary peace. And yes, it will feel unfamiliar at first, maybe even selfish, but it's not. It's alignment. Because the goal isn't to become unforgiving, it's to become discerning, to give your forgiveness meaning again, not as a reflex, but as a conscious decision. And when you do that, something powerful happens. The cycle breaks. If this conversation gave you something to think about, a new perspective, or even a small sense of clarity, then this channel is for you. Consider joining this growing community by subscribing and leave a like on the video so more people searching for answers can find these ideas too. Your support keeps these conversations alive. Until the next video, keep reflecting, keep growing, and keep pondering life's journeys.